In 1924, a survey team navigating the jagged gravel spits of Wrangel Island, a desolate shard of rock in the Arctic Ocean, recovered a small, rusted, Victorian-era thimble. It sat in the permafrost, miles from any known civilization, a domestic anomaly amidst the bleached bones of bowhead whales and wind-scoured granite. This small circle of pitted steel was the only witness to a survival event that defied the geopolitical logic of the 20th century. It belonged to a woman who outlived the empire that abandoned her. The failure of the 1921 Wrangel Island expedition was not a failure of courage, but a systemic collapse of hubris. It was driven by the Vilhjálmur-Stephensen doctrine, the arrogant, colonial belief that the Arctic was friendly and would provide a polar pasture for anyone with sufficient resolve. Stephensen, a celebrity explorer who never set foot on the island during this mission, convinced the world that a group of inexperienced young men could live off the land indefinitely. This philosophy overlooked a lethal mechanical truth. The Arctic does not provide, it merely permits. The environment is a sentient antagonist that negotiates with human life through the medium of calories and insulation. When the permit was revoked by a record-breaking ice freeze that prevented relief ships from reaching the shore, the expedition's plan of living off the land transformed into a 30-month countdown to extinction. The systemic failure was the assumption that nature is a static resource rather than a dynamic, often hostile force. By the time the realization set in, the friendly Arctic had already begun to close its jaws. The machine of the expedition was built on a foundation of 5 human components. 4 were men: Alan Crawford, Milton Galler, Fred Maurer, and Lorne Knight. They were young, educated, and fueled by the Stephensen brand of optimism. They arrived with astronomical instruments, maps of a territory they did not understand, and a mandate to claim the island for the British Empire, a geopolitical chess move played with flesh and bone. The 5th component was Ada Blackjack. She was a 23-year-old Inupiat woman who stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. Ada was not an explorer, she was a seamstress. Her presence was not a pursuit of glory, but a desperate commercial transaction. Her anchor, the singular psychological thread that bound her to reality, was her 5-year-old son, Bennett. Bennett was currently confined to a clinic in Nome, Alaska, suffering from the advanced stages of tuberculosis. Ada's technical inventory was an extension of her role as a support system. While the men carried high-caliber Winchester rifles and transit levels, Ada carried a traditional Inupiat sewing kit, bone needles, sinew thread, and a steel thimble. She also brought a Bible. Her value to the team was her ability to maintain the microclimate, the layer of insulation between human skin and the Arctic air. In a place where a torn seam in a boot can lead to gangrene within hours, Ada was the expedition's most critical mechanic. The mission was ostensibly a colonization effort. Wrangel Island sat strategically between the Siberian coast and the North Pole. By placing settlers there, Stephensen hoped to force Great Britain to annex the territory. But the geography was a silent participant in this negotiation. Wrangel is a 2,800 square mile graveyard of granite and tundra, scoured by winds that can reach 100 miles per hour. Ada's fear of the island was profound and culturally rooted. To her, the Arctic was inhabited by spirits and the Nanook, the polar bear, a predator she had been taught to fear since childhood. She was a woman who was terrified of the dark, yet she had signed a contract to spend a year in the 4-month night of the high Arctic. She did this for $50 a month, the exact cost of keeping a child with rotting lungs alive. The mission was a gamble, the British Empire's pride against a mother's survival instinct. The Empire would prove to be the weaker of the two. The routine of the expedition disintegrated on September 20th, 1922. For a year, the 5 colonists had lived in a state of precarious stability, waiting for the relief ship Teddy Bear to arrive with fresh supplies and a replacement crew. But the Arctic is a fluid clock, governed by the movement of the Beaufort Gyre and the seasonal oscillation of the pack ice. That year, the ice did not retreat. The Teddy Bear was halted by a massive, impenetrable wall of floes 20 miles from the island's coast. From the shore, the 5 humans watched the horizon, seeing only the white, jagged teeth of the pressure ridges. When the ship finally turned back to Alaska, the expedition died, and the survival event began. They were now ghosts in a machine that had lost its power supply. The chain of causality tightened in the winter of 1923, or the friendly Arctic refused to provide. The game had vanished, the seals remained beneath the ice, and the polar bears were nowhere to be found. By January, the group's high-calorie rations were depleted. They were reduced to eating hoosh, a thin, watery stew of flour and grease. It was here that Lorne Knight began to display the clinical markers of scorbutus: extreme lethargy, bruising on the shins, and the psychological fog that precedes physical collapse. On January 28, 1923, the expedition reached its moral pivot. The calculus was brutal. Knight was too weak to walk, and the food was gone. Crawford, Gala, and Maurer decided that their only hope was a Hail Mary dash across the frozen Chukchi Sea. They intended to walk 200 miles over the shifting, unstable ice to reach Siberia and bring back a rescue party. The choice was an impossible arithmetic of abandonment. To stay was to starve together. To leave was to risk everything on a journey that no one had ever survived. They left Ada Blackjack behind as Knight's sole nurse and provider. They gave her the Winchester rifle, most of the remaining ammunition, and a promise. As they disappeared into a blinding whiteout, the wind erasing their tracks within seconds, Ada became the last functional component of the British claim. She was left with a dying man in a canvas tent, while the temperature outside dropped to minus 45 degrees Celsius. With the 3 men gone, the camp's mechanics shifted from a colonial outpost to a palliative care ward. Ada's first tactical move was the stabilization of the micro-habitat. She moved Lorne Knight into the largest tent, reinforcing the canvas walls with heavy snow blocks to create a thermal barrier. In the Arctic, heat is a currency. She spent hers hauling driftwood from the frozen shoreline, her body burning precious glycogen to maintain a fire that barely kept the interior above freezing. Her inventory was a dwindling ledger: 5 sacks of flour, a small tin of tea, and a few dozen cartridges. Ada, who had been terrified of the expedition's Winchester rifles, began to study their mechanics with clinical focus. She practiced the bolt action in the minus 40 degrees Celsius air until her fingers bled and froze to the steel. She learned the physics of the hold, how the cold affects bullet trajectory, and how the wind over the Chukchi Sea pushes a lead slug off its mark. She wasn't hunting for sport, she was harvesting protein to prevent Knight's heart from stopping. Though as the weeks bled into months, the world of Wrangel Island shrank to the radius of a single kerosene lamp. The wide-angle majesty of the tundra disappeared, replaced by the suffocating intimacy of the tent. The sensory landscape was defined by the sounds of decay. There was the constant wet rattle of Lorne Knight's chest, a sound like gravel shifting underwater. There was the smell of the scurvy stench, a sickly sweet odour of decomposing blood and necrotic gum tissue that the frozen air couldn't kill. Ada's world became tactile, the scratch of a pen as she documented Knight's decline in a diary, the rough texture of the bandages she fashioned from old shirts, and the rhythmic, metallic tink of her needle passing through fox skins as she sewed boots to keep her feet from turning black. By June 1923, the physics of the human body began to fail inside the tent. Lorne Knight was experiencing the final stages of scorbutus. Technically, Knight's body was liquefying. Without vitamin C, ascorbic acid, his cells could no longer produce the hydroxyproline needed for collagen stability. The microscopic glue holding his blood vessels together dissolved. Capillaries ruptured spontaneously. Old scars from years prior began to unknit, turning into open, weeping sores. His teeth loosened in their sockets as the periodontal ligaments failed. Ada, meanwhile, entered a state of hypervigilant stasis. Her body prioritized core temperature and cognitive function over muscle mass. She was experiencing protein poisoning risk from a diet of lean fox meat, but her liver and kidneys negotiated the tax. She became a machine of pure utility, to her adrenaline-fueled metabolism holding at a knife's edge. She was the only thing standing between the dying man and the antagonist environment that was pressing against the canvas walls, waiting for the fire to go out. On June 23, 1923, The silence of the tent became absolute. Lorne Knight died. For months, the rhythm of Ada's life had been tethered to the mechanical cadence of Knight's struggling lungs. Now, that metronome had stopped. The weight of the isolation shifted from a shared burden to a singular, crushing gravity. Ada did not have the physical strength to excavate a grave in the permafrost. The ground was a slab of granite-hard ice. Nor could she face the visceral reality of his presence. In a moment of protective dissociation, she constructed a wall of heavy wooden crates around his sleeping bag, effectively sealing him away. She transformed the tent into a tomb and moved her living space to the outside. The silence that followed was not empty, it was predatory. Left alone in a landscape of white noise, Ada's mind began to erode. She experienced auditory hallucinations, the phantom voices of Crawford and Galler calling from the ice floes, or the distant, high-pitched laughter of her son Bennett. To combat the madness, she began a systemic dialogue with the environment. She spoke to the wind, she argued with the mountains. She began to treat the polar bears not as animals, but as intelligent, malicious observers. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a participant in a localized mythology. As the Arctic summer arrived, it did not bring the sun. It brought a secondary meteorological antagonist, the summer of fog, a dense, blinding wall of moisture driven by the temperature differential between the melting ice and the warming air settled over Wrangel Island. This fog was a mechanical trap. It neutralized Ada's only strategic advantage, the ability to signal a ship. For weeks, visibility was reduced to less than 5 meters. The world was erased. Ada lived in a sensory deprivation chamber of grey mist, where the sound of shifting pack ice seemed to come from every direction at once. This was the erosion. Without a horizon, the brain loses its ability to calibrate time. Ada's diary entries became fragmented, losing track of days. The fog also masked the approach of predators. Every trip to haul driftwood became a high-stakes gamble. She moved through the white void with her Winchester cocked, her ears straining for the sound of a heavy pourfall on wet gravel. The environment was no longer just waiting, it was actively obscuring her path to the future. On August 20th, 1923, the meteorological white wall finally sheared away. Through the dissipating mist, a dark, vertical line interrupted the horizon, the mast of the schooner Donaldson. When the rescue party, led by Harold Noyce, reached the shore, they did not find the skeletal, hysterical victim they had anticipated. Instead, they encountered a woman who had mastered the mechanics of her own survival. The after-action report of the rescuers noted a clinical level of preparation. Ada had taught herself to trap white foxes to supplement her protein intake, and had constructed a raised platform to protect her meat from scavengers. She had even built a sighting tower out of driftwood and crates to monitor the horizon. Physically, she was weather-beaten but functional. Her skin had the texture of cured leather, a result of chronic windburn and salt exposure. But her cognitive faculties were sharp. She had successfully navigated the survival gap, the period where the body's internal reserves are exhausted, and the subject must live entirely on the calories harvested through calculated aggression against the environment. The forensic tally of the 1921 Wrangel Island expedition was a testament to the failure of the friendly Arctic doctrine. Alan Crawford lost to the ice, presumed dead by exposure. Milton Galler lost to the ice, presumed dead by exposure. Fred Maurer lost to the ice, presumed dead by exposure. Lorne Knight, dead of systemic metabolic collapse. Ada Blackjack, alive. Physical status, stable. Psychological status, resilient. The expedition had lasted 700 days. Of the 5 colonists sent to secure British interests, only the seamstress who feared the cold remained. She had outlived the experts because she had replaced their hubris with a meticulous, maternal pragmatism. Wrangel Island today is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a restricted sanctuary where the world's highest density of polar bear dens remains undisturbed. The political borders Ada was sent to define have long since dissolved into historical footnotes. The British never claimed the island, and the Soviet Union eventually asserted the control that remains today under the Russian Federation. The lesson of the machine is found in the failure of the experts. The four men were equipped with the best Victorian technology and a philosophy of dominance, yet they were dismantled by the environment because they viewed nature as an adversary to be conquered. Ada Blackjack survived because she functioned within its constraints. She saw herself as a biological component of the island's ecosystem, moving with the tides and the seasons rather than fighting against them. Upon her return to Alaska, Ada took her $50 a month earnings and paid for Bennett's treatment. He survived. She spent the rest of her life in relative obscurity, avoiding the hero narrative the press tried to thrust upon her. To Ada, Wrangel Island wasn't a triumph of the human spirit. It was a job she had to finish. She had done what she came to do. She had survived for her son. The story of Wrangel Island remains a haunting forensic record of what happens when the mechanics of empire collide with the indifference of the physical world. While the maps were redrawn and the flags were eventually lowered, the gravel spits of the island still hold the chemical signature of that 700-day struggle. Ada Blackjack's survival was not a rejection of the Arctic's power, but a successful negotiation with it, a testament to the fact that when every external system fails, the most resilient machine is the one driven by a singular, human purpose. Her legacy is etched into the very permafrost of the high north, a reminder that the quietest voice in the room is often the one that outlasts the storm. If this forensic deep dive into the limits of human endurance resonated with you, consider joining our community. We explore the cold arithmetic of history and the biological reality of survival in the world's most unforgiving landscapes. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you never miss a chapter. From the crushing depths of the oceans to the oxygen-thin peaks of the Himalayas, we document the stories the world tried to forget.